Hello everyone, this is Annie from Smartherd. In this video series, we had been learning about the different transition effects that we can provide to our Android application. We learned about various entry and exit transition, about the shared element transition, and various ripple effects that we can provide in our Android widgets. In this video, I will be sharing a few tips on activity transition overlap. This video will tell you about how to make the transition between the activities more beautiful and smoother. So let's switch to Android Studio and see what the previous app we had made was and what small little changes can make it more beautiful. Let's switch to Android Studio. So this was the application that we have been working on in this video series. On clicking this button, we see it moves to the transition activity which has the animation, but our main activity stands here still. We don't want this and we want to apply some animation to our main activity. So what do we do for that? In our main activity.java, I have written this function with this block of code. In the main activity, I have provided the slide transition which will be appearing from the left side of the screen. And I have called this function in the onCreate method. We can provide any transition we want for the main activity. I have just used slide transition randomly. Now in this setup window animation, we will set the slide transition in our main activity. So to do that, we need to write getWindow.setReenter transition and we will put into it the slide transition variable. This setReenter transition will be executed when returning back to the main activity. Here we have set it for the main activity. Therefore, when we return to the main activity, this reenter transition method will be executed. Now let us run our application and see what happens to our main activity when we return to it. This is our application up and running. Here, on clicking any of this button, and then going back to the main activity, we can see the slide transition has been implemented into it. But there's a problem with the slide transition in the main activity and the exit transition for the transition activity. We can see these two activities here overlap. But what we want here is only after the completion of the transition for the transition activity, the main activity transition has to be executed, rather than getting overlapped this way. So for this to be implemented, what we need to do is, we need to set the return transition overlap as false. By default, this attribute is true, so we need to set it as false. Now let us set it to false. Allow return transition overlap as false. Let's see what changes this line of code has made in our application. We can see here, on clicking the XML button of the explode transition, we move to the transition activity. And then on clicking the exit button, first the transition activities animation is executed and then the transition for the main activity is executed. So here it is. The return transition overlap is set to false. And this is how our application changes. So this set allow return transition overlap is executed while re-entering the activities, that is the main activity, and exiting of the transition activity. When we look into our app, we can see that there is no exit transition for our main activity, whereas there is the entry transition for the main activity. On clicking any of this button, we can see that the transition activity has the enter transition, but our main activity does not have the exit transition. So to implement the exit transition in our main activity, we need to add the line of code as getWindow.setExitTransition. Here we need to give the name of the transition that we want to implement for the exit of our main activity. I'll be giving it here as slide transition. Now let us run our application and see how this exit transition for the main activity works. On clicking any of this button, we can see there is the slide transition for the main activity and the enter transition for the transition activity. Now the transition activity is exited and the main activity enters. But again we can see here there is the overlap between the exit of the main activity and the entry of the transition activity. So to overcome this, we need to add a line of code in our transition activity.java. We need to set the same attribute as false in our transition activity.java. So let's just copy this code and write it here in transition activity.java. This method has to be defined inside the onCreate method. But here it's not the return transition, it is the enter transition. So we have set the enter transition overlap for the transition activity as false. Now let us run our application and see what changes has been made. Now on clicking any of the 6 buttons, we can see that the exit transition for the main activity does not overlap the entry transition for the transition activity. Now this transition between the activities has been made clean. This is what we wanted. The clean exit of the main activity and the clean entry of the transition activity. After that, the clean exit of the transition activity and the clean entry of the main activity. Now, instead of doing all this, we can write a simple block of code in the styles.xml also. For the transition overlap, either specify it here or in the main activity. We have specified this transition overlap as false in our main activities and the transition activity. But in the styles.xml, we can define this attribute as false here. It is true by default, and if we want to implement it using the styles.xml, we can define it as false and then our work will be done. The enter transition overlap is set to false and the return transition overlap is also set to false. So in this way, the overlap between the activities can be prevented. Let's comment it back because we have already defined this thing in our Java files. Another thing that has to be kept in mind is that when we specify these attributes in our theme, this has to be our parent theme. In our parent theme, when we define these attributes, it is applied to all the activities in our application. In case we need to make it specific to certain activities like the main activity or the transition activity, we need to define separate theme for the particular activity and define these attributes in the themes of the respective activities. So that was all on animation. In this video series, we learned about the ripple effect, the ripple animation, about the shared element transition, the circular reveal animation. We also learned about the entry and the exit transitions, which includes the explode, slide and fade transition, and we also learned how to make the transition between the activities clean and clear without any kind of overlap. So using these animations, we can make our application more responsive and provide visual connections between different app elements. So this is all for the animation series. For further videos, stay tuned and have a good day.